We are hosting a series of interviews with activists, authors, and writers. Today we have Bhashwati Ghosh with us, who is the author of the novel Victory Colony 1950, and she has also written a very recent book of poetry called Nostalgia for a Place Never Seen. So, Bhashwati Di, to start with your debut novel, which is on the aftermath of partition, 3 years after partition, which set in Calcutta, would you like to talk about why you chose partition and your approach to partition? There have been many novels written on partition. What made you choose this? What was your research about that? If we begin with that.
Thank you, Somrita. I'm very happy to be here with you today. So speaking of Victory Colony and how it came to me, honestly, I wasn't really thinking of writing a partition novel, quote unquote. My main concern was uh, the the protagonist, who is Amula Manna. She is the central female character. And the historical event of partition does form the backdrop of my story, but my main concern was what happens to a character like that. I wanted to step into her world to see, how someone who has just experienced extreme trauma, what she has to go through, first to survive, and then to make something of her life of what is essentially a hopeless situation. And when I started exploring that world, I found that her world was expanding. And while she was alone in the face of it, she was not really all that alone because she was surrounded by similar destitute people like her. And strangely enough, the story that emerged out of this association wasn't all that bleak. To my own surprise, it wasn't all that hopeless, but it was of one of new families that formed together, and love uh, sprung in unexpected ways. And I also hoped that the story that came out on the page would provide myself and potentially the readers of the book a glimpse into the resilience and the act of collective solidarity and rebuilding that those who had lost everything, had to leave everything behind, they could accomplish. To that extent, I think I have attempted to tell the story, as best as I could, as honestly as I could. And to get for a little bit of personal background that also went into the story, I grew up in Delhi in the late 1970s and 1980s. And for a long time, the history of my own family's loss in partition, uh, it didn't really come on the screen of our consciousness that much, mine and my brothers. I grew up in a joint family, that is, my with my maternal grandparents. And so my maternal grandmother, Omia Shen, she was also a published author in Bengali. And it was she who would pique my interest in this topic. And not again with stories of loss or anything as such, but more about uh, the very happy stories of her childhood, of her childhood in East Bengal, of its lushness and its rivers and waters and the fruit orchards, freshwater ponds full of fish. It was an abundance that seemed to be in striking contrast with the lower middle class status that we were growing up with. So for a child, that was almost fantastical. So that it only as I grew up with this apparition, if you would call it, of partition, uh, that it became more apparent to me. And so as I grew up, I saw that displacement was affecting not only my grandparents' generation, who were, quote unquote, the victims of it, the direct victims, emotionally and financially, but it continued to leave its effects on successive generations. First, my mother's and my uncles, and then my brothers and mine. So I think, in an indirect way, that also was a catalyst in me wanting to write this story or tell this story.
Wonderful. I think the one great idea or a very novel idea that you have shown is resilience and the positivity of traumatic circumstances. We always talk about grief and loss, but the thing is, trauma also brings out some very positive aspects, especially I think for women. Like in the case of Amla's character, she gets to explore her own self, her own autonomy. So, would you like to talk about the women characters in your novel? And how you shaped them.
Yeah, sure. I think in the telling of refugee stories, often what we have seen is men occupy a very central space because all the movements that were led, men were at the forefront of them, and so it inevitably turns into this story of rebuilding with men in focus. But women played a huge part, especially in West Bengal. The refugee woman completely rewrote the gender paradigm in the state, especially in the city of Kolkata, where my book is set. And this is what I wanted to bring about. I wanted to highlight in my story. There has been enough written about the work done by men, but it's not as if the women were silent or quiet or only managing the house or the interiors. They played a very central role in refugee resettlement, and they changed, as I mentioned, they changed the gender dynamic of the state as they stepped into the workforce. So they, in fact, created pathways and paved the way for non refugee women to also join the workforce. And there were organizations like Mohila Atmaraksha Samiti, also known by the acronym MARS, and Chatri Sangho, Nari Shiva Sangho. These were all at the forefront of refugee rights movements. And they were composed of both refugee and non-refugee women. They worked at the Shialda station where my story begins. They worked in camps, and they worked in refugee colonies that came up, like Victory Colony. And it was for the women, it was about survival. It was a do or die situation. And they had to step into the fire for their own sake, for the sake of their children. And we have stories of how refugee women cast aside social mores to be more self reliant. And as I mentioned, they opened doors to non refugee counterparts. Um, a film that comes to mind is Shotaljit Ray's Mohanagar, in which we also see a central character like that
Hmm.
of a woman who is taking up an unconventional kind of work for the time. And a book that helped me a lot in this respect was Debali Mukherjee Leonard's Literature, Gender, and the Trauma of Partition, The Paradox of Independence. It's an excellent book, and through her scholarly research, the author shows us how refugee women broke down gender barriers. They went into train compartments, they went into telephone exchanges, offices, educational institutions, all kinds of workplaces for survival and livelihood. And from a gendered perspective, this was a significant disruption because the refugee women's entry in the workplace, again, as I said, opened the doors to other non displaced women. So in Victory Colony 1950, the coming together of women is very significant because by doing so, they are creating a family, a village, an ecosystem, all of which they have lost otherwise irretrievably. So it's also
True.
about women coming
Hmm.
together and supporting each other.
Right. Bhashwati, we don't have much time. Unfortunately, we
Yeah.
lost a lot of time in the technical
Yeah.
problems. So, to end your very recent book of poetry,
Yes.
Nostalgia for a Place Never Seen, what is it about? Very quickly, if you could wrap up in 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. The book is called Nostalgic for a Place Never
Yes.
Seen, and
Nostalgic for
it's
a Place Never
divided.
Seen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's divided into 8 sections,
Hmm.
and it focuses on themes such as migration and displacement, as probably is evident from the title. It's about finding home, but it also has themes like food, textiles, music, love, nature, and being an Indian, I carry with me the legacy of my ancestors, my grandparents, who, as I mentioned, they lost their land to the partition in 1947. So many of the poems in the book are a search for home and are infused with a lot of cultural symbols, including words and dialects and idioms that invoke a flavor of the local.
Wonderful. So we can see a connection in some ways between the two works, the novel and the poetry that you have written. Okay, Bhashwati, thank you so much. And what do we look forward to next after this? Some memoir, perhaps a personal memoir about partition, or any other work that is in the heart, but you have not yet, Would you like to tell us about your upcoming works?
Yeah, I am working on a nonfiction book on about
Mm.
Delhi. It's part memoir, but it's also a lot of oral history and some research. So wish me luck that I can finish it soon and
Wonderful.
it sees the
Wonderful.
light
Thank
of
you,
day.
Bhashwati. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. And you have always been a very kind supporter of our blog. So thank you for the interview. Thank you for putting up with all our technical problems. And I'm sure our readers, viewers, and all our audiences will love to read both Victory College in 1950, which I can vouch for is a great novel, and your very recent book of poems, Nostalgic for a Place Never Seen. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Shomrita.